presentation. It's a big pleasure to be here and to talk about climate change adaptation. So we all know that despite agreements made in Paris 2 years ago, that a changing climate is unavoidable, so therefore we need to adjust our societies, or we have to adapt to climate change in order to prevent major risks from happening. So in my talk I want to reflect with you about the question to what extent our governments, who have a major role in ensuring that our societies will be climate proof, because it's a collective interest, will do so. And I will particularly focus on a concept Joe was already referring to, concept of policy integration. Because among scholars, but also in practice, there seems to be an agreement that the best way to organize climate change adaptation is by incorporating adaptation as an objective into existing policy domains. So our society is organized into policy domains for transport, for agriculture, spatial planning, for instance. And it's considered the best way to have climate change adaptation as one of the goals to be integrated in these policy domains. So that means that there's a common responsibility to climate-proof our cities, not only by establishing a specific climate adaptation policy department, but just by taking up the responsibility together with stakeholders in these sectors. But the question that I will address in this lecture is whether or not that will work. And a brief outline. First, I will briefly say something about climate change in Ireland, but I assume you know far better than I do. The information that I took was from the EPA website, but this afternoon I understood that there's a difference between the paper reality and what's been happening on the ground, so to say. So then I will move into the subject which I'm more familiar with, the subject of mainstreaming of climate adaptation. First, something about how it works in theory, and after I hope that I've convinced you that this is the way forward, I will present some evidence of how it works in practice, and then based on that draw some conclusions and share some reflections. But first of all, I would like to acknowledge the co-authors, the co-researchers with whom I did the research project upon which this lecture is based. It's also the first time that I cooperated only with women, and it was a good experience. So climate change in Ireland. As I understand from the EPA website, also climate change will have impacts in Ireland. And also there's a need to adapt to a changing climate, which may have all kinds of effects, like sea level rise, more extreme weather events, higher risk of flooding, but at the same time risk of more droughts during the summer, and all kinds of changes, impacts on water quality and on biodiversity. So according to the EPA, there is a need for climate change adaptation. And already a national adaptation framework has been developed or is in development, and there are several policy sectors who are in the fast stage of developing sectoral adaptation plans. So that is mainstreaming as it happens in practice. And when I read this, I thought, well, Ireland is perhaps one of the front runners in mainstreaming climate adaptation into existing policy domains. So briefly, something about what this means is this concept of mainstreaming of climate adaptation into sectoral policies. And I've decided to try to explain this concept by contrasting it with a dedicated approach. So suggest policymakers have a choice of developing policies for climate change adaptation. They basically have two options. They can develop new dedicated standalone climate adaptation policies, like we have agricultural policies and other types of policies, or they can choose the mainstreaming approach. And they have different characteristics. So apparently in a mainstreaming approach, climate adaptation is added to the objectives that are already existing in a particular policy domain. So this means that adaptation will have to add value to this policy domain. You're not going to implement adaptation measures if it doesn't have any added value. But it also means that adaptation values, adaptation objectives, will have to compete with other objectives. And as climate adaptation is a rather wicked problem, as Paul was already referring to, it's very uncertain when or whether climate risks will happen. It's very uncertain. There are many stakeholders involved, so that also means that political commitment for climate adaptation may change over time. And also that policy processes may be very dynamic. And also that evaluating the extent to which mainstreaming is successful is not only by looking at the extent to which a policy domain is more climate proof, if that's possible to measure at all, but also the extent to which synergies are created. Well, in a standalone or a dedicated approach, this is different. Also, political commitment for climate adaptation is more explicit. It's also something which is more political in nature, so the debate about climate adaptation is a political debate, whereas in the mainstreaming approach, I mean, this is something dealt with by policymakers in their policy silo, so it's more hidden in the bureaucracy. So this is a way to try to characterize this mainstreaming approach. Well, why mainstreaming? In the literature, but also in practice, various arguments are provided for choosing this mainstreaming approach. One of the claimed advantages is that by mainstreaming climate adaptation into existing policy domains and policy sectors, synergies can be created. For instance, green roofs are a well-known example of a climate adaptation measure. Green roofs can help retaining water in times of heavy downpours, for instance. But it also can insulate houses. So during heat waves, it can cool buildings. So it is a powerful adaptation measure. But it also adds to, for instance, aesthetics. It can have value in terms of biodiversity. It can have health effects because people apparently feel better if they see green. So it can have synergies, or you can state it differently. If it doesn't help for climate adaptation, it helps for other purposes. So that's the first argument. The second argument is that mainstreaming is much more efficient than developing and implementing a dedicated climate adaptation policy. For instance, if infrastructure has to be maintained or city centers have to be restructured, it's more efficient to then also implement adaptation measures rather than do it apart from what's happening in the policy sector. It can be more effective because you also build on the knowledge which is already there in a particular sector, and it can also result in innovation. Like this is a very not innovative way of caring about the elderly during heat waves, but perhaps if you mainstream climate adaptation into healthcare, that can result in more innovative options. But there's also the risk of policy dilution, that trade-offs are made between sectoral objectives and climate adaptation objectives between short-term interest versus these long-term adaptation objectives, and that's what that can result in a watering down of adaptation objectives and adaptation action. So in practice, we see both approaches being implemented. For instance, in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe, national governments are developing national adaptation frameworks, national adaptation strategies, which are examples of this dedicated approach. Rotterdam is considered a front runner in mainstreaming climate adaptation, or in developing adaptation policy. Already in 2009, it had an adaptation program as one of the first cities. But we also see mainstreaming in practice, like guidelines for climate proofing, investments in agriculture, and rural developments, And on the other side, there are also examples of policies or of ideas or visions which are really integrated, and in which climate adaptation is only one of the aspects integrated in visions for more resilient societies. So societies which do well in terms of sustainability objectives, but which are also very resilient to all kinds of outside shocks, including climate adaptation, including climate change events. So in practice we see mixes of both approaches. So you now will ask yourself perhaps, okay, if it's such a powerful and such an effective way of organizing climate adaptation mainstreaming, I guess it will be happening spontaneously, but many researchers have observed that climate adaptation progress is slow. So apparently there are all kinds of obstacles, barriers to choose for mainstreaming climate adaptation into sectoral policies. So therefore, sectoral departments or municipalities or other actors have to be incentivized, let's say, to implement climate adaptation mainstreaming. And this can be done in various ways. And this is taken from a paper by one of the co-authors, Christine Wamster. She distinguishes between different ways in which climate adaptation action can be organized, can be mobilized. So on the one hand, public actors like departments, state departments or municipalities can implement all kinds of programs themselves, so they can include it into day-to-day on-the-ground activities. So basically that means already implementing mainstreaming adaptation. But it can also change routines or organizational structures, promote cooperation, or they can even change planning procedures in order to incentivize the mainstreaming of climate adaptation into sectoral domains and policies. And another way of trying to promote mainstreaming is the so-called directed mainstreaming, where there is high-level support and also high-level incentives for lower tiers of government to implement mainstreaming adaptation objectives and measures. Is it clear thus far? Yeah. Okay, so this is, given this background, we were interested in making stock out of taking stock of what's happening regarding mainstreaming in practice worldwide. And for this purpose, we decided to do a review of scientific empirical research on climate mainstreaming. So we collected a lot of scientific articles, screened these articles because we were interested in empirical analyses and not so much in conceptual work, and there is a lot of conceptual work. So eventually we ended up with 87 scientific papers, which we coded and in order to draw lessons about what's happening with climate adaptation mainstreaming, and also what are the main drivers of adaptation mainstreaming, but also what are the main barriers. And also to see whether or not there's a difference between different countries or different continents. And funny enough, there's only one paper about Ireland. This may be remarkable, but on the other hand, in countries like my country, the Netherlands, and in Germany, there have been very large research programs over the last years in which the government subsidized quite a lot of research. So not strange that quite a part of the papers that we found are from the Netherlands or from Germany. So there was kind of peak in number of publications around 2040. There was also the time that these national programs, research programs, ended, and now it seems there's a decline in interest in research, empirical research on climate adaptation mainstreaming. So a first observation was that in all the practices of mainstreaming that were reported in these articles, majority of practices of mainstreaming was at the national level and a bit less about local government mainstreaming. And this is, on the one hand, remarkable because many scholars assign a major role for climate adaptation to municipalities, because many people live in municipalities, of course, but also a lot of services and infrastructures are in these cities. But on the other hand, it's also in line with other studies who have shown that progress in municipal adaptation planning is still very slow. Then we looked at what are the major climate risks that are being reported in these practices. And we see that, we cannot see that there's a direct or explicit pattern, but what the main climate change risks are addressed, like flooding, extreme weather events, droughts, and also things like very specific sea level rise in relation to erosion. So we cannot say whether or not the right climate risks are being targeted in these empirical cases, but there's not a clear sign that particular risks are over or under addressed, so it seems. But then we looked at the policy domains in which climate adaptation mainstreaming is observed, and here we see some remarkable things. Our coding scheme perhaps is a bit abstract in terms of the major mainstreaming was found in what we labeled environmental and natural resource management, which is a very broad category, including coastal zone management, agriculture, but also nature conservation, followed by urban and regional planning and land use, water and flood risk management, and crisis management and risk disaster reduction. But what is very remarkable is that mainstreaming is not so much reported in critical infrastructures like housing or infrastructure for transport, telecommunications, which require long-term investments and would seem to be very important for mainstreaming climate adaptation. So apparently in these sectors climate change is not considered that important. At least there's not that much action being observed. And then we looked at the strategies that have been employed in order to promote climate adaptation mainstreaming. And here we see that, these are a bit technical terms, but most of the strategies that are reported are voluntary strategies, so strategies that municipalities or state departments implement themselves, so changing their organizational structures or planning procedures. But only in a minority of cases directed mainstreaming is observed. And directed mainstreaming means that higher levels of government either make climate adaptation mainstreaming mandatory, or that they support mainstreaming by lower tiers of government by means of subsidies of information or by means of a combination. So this means that mainstreaming often is a rather informal, bottom-up, voluntary act. Do you think that is problematic? Yeah. Why would that be problematic?
Well, I have my own specific agenda. I don't know an awful lot about climate change. I'm not involved in the research, but I'm part of a group that are trying to oppose the government pushing ahead with a motorway through a densely populated residential area. Mm-hmm. So they want to build a motorway through where a lot of people are living so that they can have porch traffic go from Ringaskiddy into the other parts of Ireland. And they're not looking at the carbon footprint, they're not looking at people's health, and they're just going ahead. Anyway, you look at the Arcus Convention, and we're meant to have a say in policy, and we should have some way of changing the way we do things. And we have suggested an alternative route for the motorway through agricultural land, and they've just laughed at it. And we had a meeting with the TII, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, mm-hmm. and we discussed it with them at length back in August, and we put our concerns to them. And we met with them again recently, and they said, yes, we did look at your alternative route. It may be a little dearer, but we're not going to do that because it won't meet with the objectives of our project. So their objectives are to get a motorway built as quickly as possible, so they're going to widen an existing road. And there's no thought for, the fact that we're going to have 35,000 vehicles going through a densely populated area, 4,000 HGVs going every day, because it's going to be a roll-off ferry. And I mean, it's a Tier 1 port. This is what has been approved by our board in North Carolina Skiddy. But a Tier 1 port should have a rail link. They're not looking at the big picture of infrastructure. It's crazy.
So, but this is a nice example, not about climate change adaptation. But it's an example of
it's a very unhappy story.
No, but it's an example of sectoral thinking, one-dimensional, and not from an integrated perspective.
So I'm here to learn, and I hope that I will learn something tonight. To help inform government policy.
Who has some experience or knowledge of climate adaptation and has an idea of whether or not mainstreaming as being an informal and voluntary approach is a good thing or is a bad thing?
Well, one connected to that example actually is a community actually called Cove Zero Waste Group that's trying to do something about the waste situation. The problem, of course, is that the government policy, national policy, is building incinerators. So we've just had Pullbeck incinerator starting up in Dublin, and it's a very blinkered view when it comes to sustainability. It's not looking at the emissions that are coming from that, or even the use of the resources. That we're destroying resources that could actually be used as we've got a circular economy approach in Europe. We've got a national government that is just not helping communities who want to get to zero waste, but have no help from.
So it's also not a very integrated or holistic approach. And how should that be changed then? In terms of, for instance, these approaches, would more rules from higher levels of government help, or?
I think it has to happen.
That's happened from grassroots, but it has to come down from the top as well to have, like when you talk about land use, infrastructure we're building now is going to be there 50 years from now, and it's been designed, as you say, in one sector or with one lobby group in mind, and instead of, it has to come from both what the community wants and also from regulatory mainstream guidelines that none of our local action plans have anything around this in them. There's all this speak, we should do, we shall do, we shall do. We need to look after our environment, but there's actually no actions. It's all speak. And this is, so unless it's regulatory, you're not going to get actions, because when it's regulatory, there has to be money behind it, and then you can see actions, and the actions should be driven by the communities in which they're going to be built. So there needs to be actions.
Another one there was the flood relief. Typically, it's happened that now it's moved to backwater. The step up 20 years ago, when we can't talk, right? Then they came out to Mallow, and then they came out to Fermoy, right? And the big problem there now is I asked a couple of meetings with the OPW, and I asked, has the rate of water has it increased? No, they could tell me. Everybody knows, there's going to be a massive bank erosion eventually, right? And the big worry I see, but it is the two bridges, what Mallow and Fermoy, because I worked in Penny office myself in Aircam. And there was an engineer in Mallow 20 years ago, and he became very concerned about the Mallow bridge, right? And he closed 2 eyes of it, because he was afraid of the bridge collapsing. And 5-10 years ago, when they opened the 2 eyes again. So now there's a massive flow of water. So I know from there was a kind of a contract between two publishers, one in Fermoy and one in Mallow. And he was in Bridgehouse Bar, and he knew when his flood reached peak, he knew it exactly 8 hours, and the flood came to the pumps of Fermoy. And they had that contact between them. And they say, if that was done now, it's probably down to about 6 hours.
And is that because of short-term thinking, or is it because of one-dimensional thinking, or is it a lack of knowledge? Or?
Well, I was at a meeting that there recently, and someone said that again about another area that was being done, And they said, why not go farther up into the river and slide slow down the river rather than be building Kimford walls down here inside the Cork City. When they could go up, but 20 miles further and kind of slow down. Because everybody is draining. Now, if we look at any farm around the water developing, they're all draining. So the water just hits the bottomlands, and they're draining so much now that there's no, the water hits the main river instantly. So that there's no hole back in it, which the result is you're going to get a massive flooding. And with this, as you say now, this climate change now, that's going to have more frequently. Floods.
Okay, well, very interesting to hear these examples. They're not all about climate adaptation, but they point to the same phenomenon. And that we've organized governments in such a way that we have specialized policy silos, but that they partly work against each other or don't take into account the other objectives. Okay. So nobody thinks this is a good situation? Yeah?
Can you, if I were to find out about, the quandaries of mainstreaming approaches with regard to European states, can you give me kind of links to where that information is currently? And
Can you repeat your question?
the regulatory mainstreaming approaches,
Yeah.
obviously they're used within European states. Can you, the preponderance of them within European states and the effectiveness, can you kind of, where's that information?
About which approach is found in which country? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The preponderance, because obviously there's variation.
Yeah.
I just need to link to the info.
Yeah.
But obviously there must be info on, the approaches with each other.
Yeah, we didn't do that analysis, but I'm not sure if it is possible. But if you send me an email, I can check later.
Okay, I have another question. When you say the practical approaches seem to be lacking, can you give an example of practical approaches which you think work, and where are they lacking? Can you just
I'll come back to that later.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? And but remind me if I don't answer your question completely, then I'll come back to that. Yeah. Okay. Well, but this question, I mean, it's a crucial question. The idea of mainstreaming is based on the idea that policy sectors know best how to organize, or how to deal with a problem, like climate change adaptation or budget cuts or whatever. But that seems to be conflicting with the idea that if it's too voluntary, perhaps there's not enough action on the ground. It's a voluntary act that doesn't need to be a problem if policy sectors take up their responsibility and develop enough adaptation plans. But what we found is that in most of the cases reported in these 87 papers, policy outputs have been produced, so there can be statements like we're going to take into account climate change adaptation, or we will take a long-term perspective, or we will focus on extreme weather. But it only translates into concrete actions in only half of the cases. So this suggests that there may be an implementation gap. That these statements look nice on paper, but are not implemented on the ground. And if we then look at how these scientists, these researchers from these 87 papers evaluate or talk about the measures being taken, and also these policy outputs, it gets worse, so to say. We try to label these policy outputs, so these written statements, the paper, so to say, in terms of effective mainstreaming, partly effective, or ineffective. And ineffective meaning it doesn't help climate-proof this particular sector. And we did the same with what we then label outcome, concrete measures being implemented, like green roofs or other measures. And what we see is that on paper, many of these ideas or statements or goals look pretty effective. But if you then look at the actual measures that have been reported in these studies, the picture is rather different. So at best, these measures are partly effective. So that's not something that makes us very happy. And it also means that there was something also we came up with this afternoon. Margaret said something about all kinds of monitoring reports that are being published about, for instance, progress in adaptation planning in Europe. On paper, it looks very good. Many countries have developed national adaptation frameworks or policy plans, or are developing monitoring and evaluation schemes. But this is all paper, and if you look what's happening on the ground, the picture is much less optimistic, much less positive. So then we also wanted to know what explains this progress in adaptation, mainstreaming or lack of progress. And at first we wanted to know which of these strategies is more or less successful. It was very difficult to analyze, because in most cases multiple strategies were reported, observed at the same time. So that's why we looked at more general what helps in terms of in terms of producing policy outputs or implementing measures, and what are the main barriers. And here we see that the main drivers are political commitments, cooperation with private actors, which is something we didn't expect beforehand, so-called policy entrepreneurs, so these are people from within policy departments who actively advocate for climate adaptation action, or so-called focusing events, extreme weather events. They always help raising awareness. And subsidies from higher level of governments. This has to do with this directed mainstreaming as a strategy. And the main barriers were found in terms of resources, cooperation, coordination within departments, but also between departments, conflicting interests. So stated differently, drivers mainly have to do with putting climate adaptation on the sectoral policy agenda, and the main barriers have to do with implementing these nice statements, these nice objectives. And this also explains why there's such an implementation gap between stating that you are going to climate-proof a particular policy sector and actually doing it. And we also looked at cases where that was successful in terms of, the researchers found policy outputs, these statements, but where there was no implementation. And here also, these are more practical barriers, so related to the actual implementation. Organizational problems, but also problems with finance and lacking interests. But if there's political commitment for a particular objective, like climate proofing, and there's sustained political commitment, then this doesn't need to be a problem, because there's always money if there's priority. But it shows that apparently in this mainstreamed approach that the implementation is a problem. Well, this shows in more detail what the main barriers and the main drivers are. I'm colorblind, but I think the drivers are in orange and the barriers in green or red, or it's differently. At least the bottom row are barriers. So it shows that most of the barriers are found in the organizational domain, but conflicting interest is also a very important barrier. So what we conclude from this review of 87 scientific empirical papers is that there seems to be an implementation gap regarding climate change adaptation mainstreaming. Also that it emphasizes again that at the local level less is being done than what's considered necessary. Also that political commitment at higher levels and lack of cooperation and coordination in the implementation are key challenges. And this in combination with the finding that most strategies that are being employed in order to promote climate adaptation mainstreaming are informal and bottom-up and voluntary, Well, this may suggest that we need to have more directed mainstreaming, so that our national governments have to make climate adaptation less voluntary, but demand from policy sectors and demand from municipalities that they do develop adaptation plans. And of course do it in such a way that synergy is realized, but it suggests that if we leave it to our policy sectors and the municipalities, they will give priority to other objectives. And then this means, so in part, that we have to move to a more dedicated approach. So perhaps continue developing national adaptation plans, but specifying responsibilities for specific sectors. And this also means that climate adaptation mainstreaming is no longer something which is dealt with in policy silos by policymakers, far away from citizens and communities and stakeholders, but that it's brought to the political agenda and that it is visible, that there's political struggle about it. And I think that that's one of the ways to go ahead. And then, of course, it can be further developed and implemented at policy sector level, by municipalities, but then it's less voluntary. But then again, I'm not too optimistic about whether or not that will work, because it will mean that national governments will have to take responsibility for assigning responsibilities for climate change adaptation. An experience that we had with a research report that we produced 2 years ago for the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment, was a bit worrisome. As part of the development of the national adaptation policy for the Netherlands, a lot of research was commissioned, and we were asked to do an assessment of responsibilities for climate adaptation as they were present in legislation and in all kinds of sectoral policies. And we looked in particular at critical infrastructures like ICT, telecommunication, transport, energy. And one of our conclusions was that it is not clear who is responsible for climate adaptation. Well, it is clear if you're a lawyer, because then you know that, for instance, utilities have a particular responsibility for adapting to or for reducing risks like climate change risk, but also other kinds of risks. Also that consumers have their own responsibility in case of a blackout, that they have a responsibility themselves to have backup capacity. But in practice nobody knows, and it's not made explicit. And that's a real barrier if you want to promote progress in mainstreaming. So our advice was make these responsibilities clear, communicate about these responsibilities so you can raise awareness, and also monitor progress in mainstreaming. And as a government intervene if you think that, for instance, in a sector like ICT, too little progress is made in terms of updating climate change projections and risk assessments, then as a government intervene and demand adjustments of adaptation plans or so. But this advice was picked up by the Environmental Assessment Agency of the Netherlands, who had to produce an advisory report for the Ministry of Infrastructure and the Environment based on all this commissioned research. In the report, well, it's in Dutch, but it's in the middle. The term responsibility was mentioned 43 times, and our report was cited 8 times. So that made us very happy, because societal impact now is a very important issue in academia. And we were very proud to say, well, our report was used. But then in the eventual national adaptation strategies, responsibility was mentioned 7 times, of which 4 times in terms of co-responsible. We are all co-responsible for climate adaptation. That was the national government. And not any reference to our reports. But this showed that the national government is very hesitant in assigning responsibilities or defining clear adaptation measures. It's still something which is, well, considered to be a joint responsibility, but then it's still a rather voluntary. So, well, summarizing, mainstreaming currently it may be a very promising strategy in theory, but because it's too voluntary, in practice progress is too slow. Directed mainstreaming, so higher level support, but also assigned responsibilities to policy sectors and municipalities for climate adaptation seems to be problematic, at least in the Netherlands as a case study, but I think we're not unique in that respect. So then the question is, how can we mobilize more support or more incentives to promote climate adaptation mainstream? Well, of course we don't want to wait for a severe or major weather event, but perhaps it's a good idea to mobilize civil society or to mobilize the private actor if we cannot, if the governments, our governments don't do enough. But Paul was, when he introduced the Climate Lab, he showed that there are four different foci of Climate Lab. One of the things is transitioning our society. We have to transform in order to be resilient against climate change disasters, but also other kinds of societal dynamics. And from that perspective, well, perhaps mainstream is not the best way because it's very incremental, and if it stays so voluntary as it is now, I have my doubts whether or not it's enough to climate-proof our societies. So I started with some questions, and I promised you to discuss these questions. I end with new questions, and perhaps it's also a bit of depressing news, but this is what I wanted to share with you, and thank you for your attention.